most a lot of social science, especially since functionalism beginning in the 1950s, relied heavily on incorporation rather, as its the end product. It would a lot of functionalist sociology worked from a model that assumed incorporation. What I like about David's approach to culture is he allows for incorporation and reincorporation, but it really starts from the premise of refusal, and that there may be incorporations, but that it creates that there are still paradoxes and contradictions that are being played out. And the contrast that he illustrated, the case studies, is he relied on an ethnographic reading of heroic societies, of course, in his usual fashion across myriad cultures and regions. And then he used their efforts arose as a rejection, a conscious rejection of commercial bureaucratic relations. And that the logic of heroic society can become recovered and reincorporated, and leading to new rounds of schizmogenesis, whereby they are rejected in social orders created in the very rejection of those heroic elements. So what I like there is that it sees culture as a deliberate political project, but a deliberate political project that can be done in ways of through refusal rather than or in addition to resistance itself. And so to my mind, he helps move along theories of social science that have relied on these models that I guess they're entropic in a sense, that they do argue toward a resolution of contradictions. And, you know, at the high point, we can see that with Francis Fukuyama's notion about the end of history. But that there's really a different kind of political act going on, where people are constantly in everyday ways are defining themselves against things. And so this approach allows for an ethnographic model to trouble some of the narratives about what constitutes the quote political realm in social science. Earlier today, I received a wonderful email on aesthetics that I would love to have. I don't want to put Kenneth on the spot, but it sounded like he was hoping to talk through this intervention that he shared with us, which I was really moved by. I don't want to put his words through into my mouth. So I'm going to ask if he wants to share with us here, now that there might be some people who are here who have not received the intervention that you composed. So I'm hoping that you'd be willing to give a gloss of that, because I think it relates nicely to some of the ideas that David Graeber develops in this article. Because if he's trying to write, if David Graeber's trying to suggest, he ends this article saying, asking, what would a world history look like if we did start from creative refusals as a basic unit of sociality? this collective effort to define oneself against something, how might we be able to rethink world history and then, social sciences, and of course, the very idea of what constitutes scholarship. So, Kenneth, would you like to jump in here?
Sure, but I don't want to take too much time. And I'm not 100% sure if I can connect it directly to what we're supposed to be talking about today. Because I had written something that was inspired by one of our past sessions. This was the session on what was that paper again? It was on the dialogic process and conversation as a mode of knowing, and how how David contrasts that against this notion of this classical notion within academia of insight as something that is the product of great individual minds, that monastic self, right? One of the sort of dialogic insights from that conversation was that there's these ideals of these aesthetic ideals really within scholarship, and one of them is coherence, that our work should be coherent. This usually presents itself as a standard of method or as a standard of ethics, i.e. What is one is true or what is good, but really it's a standard, I think, of what is beautiful, that one should look coherent. One should present oneself in one's writing or in one's seminar interventions or in participation in reading groups like this as someone who's coherent. An insight from that conversation, I forget now the individuals because it's been several weeks. I think some of us were there. Hello. That perhaps once we recognize coherence as an ideal, we can then pose it against cogence as a different ideal, bringing worlds together. So what I tried to argue within that little essay, which is part of my dissertation, is if we were to explicitly abandon, i.e. refuse coherence as an aesthetic ideal, and perhaps define our aesthetic ideal as one of cogence, i.e. are we bringing worlds together? Are we getting people to have conversations that we otherwise would not be able to have? Then perhaps that is a better standard for judging, in my case at least, graduate student work. Because that's always the sort of disciplining mechanism. Like, your work should be coherent. Like, it should, if you're citing this thinker, you should be citing all these other thinkers. You should be keeping yourself siloed within an established framework, so on and so forth, right? Like it presents itself as such in graduate student spaces, at least. So perhaps me writing this out was a way of refusal of a specific subculture, in this case, an academic subculture that emphasizes coherence with an edifice that is increasingly untenable, an untenable way of thinking about knowledge. I think I'll end there.
Yeah, thank you. That's exactly, you put in words what I couldn't, because it's part of your dissertation, so it's being done in a very formal institutional setting that has a history that goes back several hundreds of years, and yet you're arguing for something that that is outside. You're arguing in favor of forms of knowledge that are generated outside of institutions, which is what we're doing right here, which is probably why we're doing it right here. So when you sent it, I responded and mentioned how inspired I felt by it, because it really encapsulated, for me at least, this idea of speculation and surprise that really, which, if you think about what speculation and surprise is, it's magic. And the sort of the magic that's underneath all of this I think, I mean, as humans, we're drawn to. Like, I think David Wengrow has talked about how early cognition was about thinking magically. It was magical kinds of thinking in the Paleolithic period. So thank you for sharing that. The article, you know, it's very ethnographic. I am not an anthropologist, so I accepted the sorts of comparisons that he was drawing and read this with very little expertise whatsoever. So the, you know, the thesis I kind of accept on its face, but I'm not very well read in heroic societies at all. Commercial bourgeois society, yes. So, you know, I get where the argument goes, but it's really the elements of the heroic society were novel to me. I wonder if anyone would like to sort of comment on how David Graeber understands heroic society in the way that he uses it in this piece.
Maybe I will ask Vassily to comment on connection between this article of David and the new book that is coming out in October, because I proposed to read this article as a comment on my question about ancient Greece as a heroic society that is mentioned in this text.
Okay, Nika. I actually haven't read I haven't read this specific part of the book that is going to be published in October about heroic societies. What I can do, however, maybe I can quickly talk about the way David Graeber introduced this paper during his course on value. If I remember it well, it was I think it was he was claiming that his paper was a part of a literature that he called literature resistance on cultural refusal, on ethnogenesis. And in anthropology, there are now quite a lot of papers about that. I think he gave us some references that I'm really happy to share with you, with the group, maybe at the end. But one of the main references was obviously, you may be familiar with his name. It's James Scott. Is an American anthropologist who wrote some books that became quite successful, and they're always about this resistance. I think also his first book was drawing on a notion, the notion of moral economy of Thompson, and he was talking about these very specific moments where you have a revolt, and then later his books were more about things that more like everyday life, everyday resistance. And I think David Graeber was more interested in these kind of things. I remember that he told us that his favorite book by James Scott, he was actually quite critical about him when he was talking about when he was introducing his work. His favorite book was Domination and the Art of Resistance, where he where he developed this notion of hidden transcripts as opposed to public transcripts. There are things that it's kind of very small scale resistance. There are things that you can't really say out loud to your master if you're a slave, for example, but that you're going to tell your slave mates. It's actually a really interesting book, and I suspect that David Graeber liked it because he offered a maybe a different approach to power that was quite distinct from Foucault's approach. So there is a book actually in which James Scott talks explicitly about schizmogenesis. This is this book called The Art of Not Being Governed, and in which he develops on this very large area in Southeast Asia where people just go up the hill because they go up the hill fleeing the government and the impositions of rules, and so that's an example that I think he gives the reference in the article, and he was also saying that it was all very interesting because I should give a little bit like some elements of context because it was a course on value, and he was. I think he found it a bit problematic that we were talking about values in terms of what we are against. Because on the other hand, there is the question what there is the question what we are for. You know, what are the important values, yeah, and so basically, I don't know where I'm. So yeah, this is basically where he introduced heroic societies, and heroic societies. So there is quite a lot of literature about that, to be honest. So heroic societies are societies that are seen as the barbarian fringes of those great commercial bureaucratic societies of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley. And they are people who came to define themselves as in opposition to the values of these societies, which were commercial bureaucratic. So basically, you have on the one hand these bureaucratic societies where the ultimate values, if you want, are order, efficiency, wealth, security, and on the other hand, you have those heroic society, which are very much the kind of societies that are told in the great epics. Their main values being charisma, contests, personal renown, and a contempt for material wealth. And this is so what David Graeber is trying to say is so the story that James Scott is telling is all very interesting, but we should not be it would be wrong to think that being in opposition will necessarily create an egalitarian society. And he gives, so basically the main argument is to say that things are very often more complex. And he gives several examples. So heroic societies, the biblical style patriarchy. If you read the book Depth, he talks a little bit more about that. So in this paper, he develops these anti-heroic societies, but he was giving also, I think he made us read other papers, like this paper written by two anthropologists about the Salah Sakas, and some other paper that I'm going to share, but basically there are many examples of that. So the story is a bit more complicated, and there are, I think, two main things in this paper is that societies as Mauss was saying, that they never develop in isolation. They are always connected. And the second thing is that, if we can find anti-heroic society, then when do you stop this process of schizmogenesis? So, and can we trace back a little bit further than what we usually do? Yes, Zoom. Yeah, that's actually this is the title in French of The Art of Not Being Covered.
Thank you. I wasn't aware that this was such that this article is such a deliberate engagement with Jim Scott's work, but I now totally see it. Jim Scott, his work, I think he would probably acknowledge that he will romanticize resistance, and that his popularity as an intellectual figure, especially in the 1990s, that it helped promote a kind of cottage industry of resistance studies that looked for episodes of resistance, narrated them, recovered them, narrated them. The way that Graeber goes about critiquing Jim Scott's work, though, is really nuanced, and I think that's why I never understood. When I read this article, I didn't realize how he's really engaging with. He's really showing ethnographically evidence to contradict some of the assumptions that Jim Scott makes as kind of perennial driving forces in society. I mean, Jim Scott uses I think there is a typology or a characterization to some of his transhistorical explanations or categories or ways of understanding change over time. Do you remember, Vassily, the two anthropologists you mentioned? I'm just wondering what David Graeber would have assigned in addition to this or alongside this.
Yeah, I actually have it here. The paper is called Ethnogenesis, Ethnicity, and Cultural Refusal. So ethnogenesis is actually often yeah, it's how they actually label the literature now. They talk about that. And the two anthropologists are Rachel Core and Karen Powers. I'll share the paper, but it's actually well, it's another kind of this kind of societies, but it's another type basically. And the story is that so the Salakas, they live in Ecuador, and their dialect is the Quechua, and we often represent them as like a society where these are people who preserve their customs, and these customs are seen to go back to Inca times, and in fact the anthropologists these two authors are saying actually maybe not. It was actually this place where they were living was actually a refuge area, if I use a term that Scott uses, where people, different sorts of people were coming to fleeing the Spanish, and so what is the story again? So now we see them as we see them as representatives of the Inca culture, but they are just actually people who fled together, who flee together, a little bit like the other stories that he basically talks about. Madagascar being a really good example of that. Yeah, I will show the paper right now.
So if I understand correctly, David Graeber's critique was that really considerations of ethnogenesis are really starting from a flawed premise, because there is no inherent ethnogenesis. One needs to model so that it really is understood as schizmogenesis, because there is no genesis. Am I understanding that correctly?
Anyone want to try to let's make it like a dialogue, a collective dialogue, maybe between with other people in the group. I'm happy to answer that, but like maybe those who didn't say anything yet, and I actually say it quite a lot, and I don't want to be too present on this. Scott, do you want to say something? You were you seem to be willing to say something, as I saw you moving around. And actually, I think this is the first time I see you. Welcome here.
Nice to see you, Vassily. I won't comment on that because I don't know, if I'm honest. So, anybody else?
Anybody else?
I have some comments, but also on a different issue.
Yeah, and we don't have to go down this direction. Obviously, Vassily and I can have conversations at other times. So I'm very adept at derailing conversations. That's one of my talents. Zenaida, am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Yeah, Zina is also fine.
Zina, okay, thank you. Sure, I'd love to hear what you were wanting to say.
Yeah, well, I was puzzled by one aspect, actually about the relation of the, let's say, neighborhood of wealth and the value of this wealth, because David starts his essay with an example where actually, with the example they are described in by this archaeologist who he cites, and where he says that, let me just quote it directly. Yeah, so that the society, there were vast quantities of new material goods, while at the same time rejecting the ultimate values of the societies with which they were in contact. So, which means that here he kind of emphasizes the role of the presence and of this material wealth close to the society which actually refuses. And then later on, when he kind of creates a list of characteristics typical for the society, this relation is not mentioned, but instead what is emphasized is the role of, let's say, secondary symbolical culture, well, secondary semiotic system, as Lotman would call it, for example. And actually, when you read this characteristics that he lists, like the role of the, not theater, but theatricality of this society, the role of these kind of playful practices and rituals, one could also think that it's actually, whether it's all about kind of rich society that still choose a different style of life, or whether this presence of material goods doesn't play a role, or what role it plays. And at least to me, I think this question kind of remains unanswered, because we see that there is this refusal, but obviously we know very little about those societies that are like partly documented, but mainly disappeared and left little traces. And I think this is something that allows to make the argument, this lack of information is at the same time productive, because it allows to make this argument, but at the same time, this is exactly the weakness of the argument, because we actually know very little about those cultures and those societies. And like you have a lot of question mark many times. And so it's like one line of my thought, and another line is about the political argument, which is very sympathetic, and so which I share. But at the same time, if we think that let's say we need to convince other people, or at least to pass the message on the topic to other people, and at the same time we kind of see from the examples that all these societies they vanished. And I think implicitly it's also present in the text that they vanished because they have chosen this alternative path. And this argument is at the same time against the evolutionary discourse and actually pro-evolutionary discourse, because in a way it's a kind of objective truth. And so I wonder, how would you argue, or how would you convince other people to choose this path if actually you have kind of no success story? Or what should it be this a story about a samurai death? Or like what should be beautiful about this story? Yeah, besides the political choice as opposed to some pragmatic survival by aggressive means. Well, these are just thoughts in different directions.
Yeah, you're ultimately getting at what really the final question is, which is how can we know what we don't know? And I think what David Graeber is saying is our answer to that is cultural, it is political. Not that he's dismissing science, but that, or objective facts, but that, you know, it's our job to ask the question always, and to never think that we can't have answers. And that, you know, I guess the Zapatistas would say, caminando preguntamos, you know, walking we ask. And so I think there's a certain element of that to this. And you really hit upon it, you know, when you said that the greatest contribution of the article is its weakness, because there's the survival, there's the evolutionary argument about survival of the fittest. But if these are bands of people that are leaving no historical record, then you really do have to turn to archaeology. But then what if there aren't archaeological bits of evidence left? So you're trying to recover something that it ultimately is impossible to recover. And I think that's where the speculation lies.
About your second point, Zenaida, I thought that the example that David Graeber gives on Mississippian civilized societies, this civilization, it's actually a bureaucratic. I mean, it is it is thought to be the kind of commercial bureaucratic society, and it's actually a counterexample where people flee. They want to live on a more egalitarian egalitarian mode, and the bureaucratic commercial civilization disappears. So of course we're not sure about that, but until we don't have a better explanation for that, we can believe that it might be true, and it's actually a really good interesting counterexample of that. Also, there are many societies that refuse to live like us, for example, and they are still around. One of the things that James Scott was saying is that these people they don't want to make too much publicity about it because and that might be also why we don't hear about their success, is that they just don't want to be bothered.
And plus, I think the whole idea of societies is always interconnected, is not that we can have one and don't have another. So it's not, one type of society is always prevail and another one is always dying out. At least that's what I understood from this article. It's not clearly, this type of society is always winning, and about another we just don't know anything. That's how I understand it.
Yes, this is actually, I think it's a good argument, because in a way it's about kind of, if we see the fittest, it means that that there exist others, that we kind of don't see, or we don't want to see, because let's say the hegemonic discourse is usually organized by the fittest. But I can maybe also give some background to my thinking, because for example, in my work, where I argue in a way that that kind of the life with shortages is perhaps the most ecological way to live in the society. It very often receive the questions style. Let's say, would you invite us to go kind of back to the lack of comfort, or like, thank you, we had it enough, so like we don't want to queue, or not to have enough of toilet papers, and so on and so forth. And I mean, this is a kind of argument you need to answer. And I usually answer it, of course, with also kind of similar intellectual argument, saying that we need to challenge our economic imagination, or we need to allow for alternative possibilities, or we don't need to get our mind colonized by some mainstream ideas. But at the same time, I know that these are arguments that are not convincing for everybody, and I'm always kind of looking for additional arguments, and that's why I kind of now I ask these questions here out loud with the hope that maybe you will also give me some additional good arguments. But I think these are just kind of important critiques of the everyday considerations that we need to keep in mind while offering whatever utopian ideas or invitations. Yeah. Thank you.
Zina, are you asking for a persuasive argument in favor of utopianist thinking?
In a way, yes, but also utopianist thinking that would definitely limit you in some of the comfort you enjoy today, perhaps. Because I mean, any utopian thinking also implies that you will choose something at the expense of something else.
Yeah, I think so we would want to avoid any universal definitions of what constitutes comfort. And there might be comforts that one can enjoy without having to make choices to give up comfort. Especially if one lives in communities or associates with people where the members of that community really see life as something other than particular kinds of comfort, and that they privilege providing mutual aid and care. Obviously, any community is only as good as the members in it. And so it depends on how one defines society. I mean, I know that there are certain comforts that I could enjoy because I have a lot of white male privilege. And some of those comforts I do enjoy. And I make no bones about those comforts. But there are other comforts that I consciously and deliberately decline because those are choices that, when I think of the cascading series of refusals, reincorporations, and renewed refusals, I connect certain kinds of comfort more immediately to structures of violence that I don't want to be a part of. And you know, also knowing that there are comforts that I enjoy that are the product of immediate structures of violence, and yet, you know, I'm still participating in that. And that, you know, I think each of us have to resolve that in our own way, and in dialogue with others that we consider members of our community, however we define our community. But communities are often defined without consent. So like, I belong to a lot of communities that I have not consented to. Yet institutionally, bureaucratically, I've consented. You know, when military service, it was easier to sign the paper and sign up for the draft than it was to run away from the authorities. It's usually, you know, same with police. So, but I don't recognize their authority, yet obviously I recognize their authority. So you know, it comes down to how I define, how I personally, for me and the choices I make, define comfort. You know, utopia, I always want to think in utopian terms because it's a lot better than thinking in nihilist terms. You know, and again, it's not that it's either or, like it's all just, you know, I mean, I'm like I would imagine, like many people here, I'm full of all sorts of contradictions. And so I like David Graeber's take on anarchism. The reason why I personally will now identify myself as an anarchist, if people like ask, how do you identify? Is because he viewed it like a lot of other good anarchists as an ethics of practice first. So it's not what I am, it's what am I doing? And I mean, I just a few minutes ago took a sip from a Starbucks. It doesn't get much more violent than that. I mean, this is crass commercialism. You know, I got it for my wife. She likes Starbucks. She gave me the leftover. My own kind of like political take on things is I like the scraps of people who have stuff that I don't. And like, I'm fine with living off the scraps, even though there are some things where like, you know, well, actually, most of these are probably picked up from the side of the road. That's another story. So yeah, you know, I wonder if the way I'm responding is sort of speaking to some of these disquiets that you might have.
May I ask, Zinaida, why do you use this term utopia at all? Because the whole idea these societies constantly exist, you know, alongside with each other. So they cannot exist separate without. It's not that we're choosing. One is normal and one is imaginary. They're constantly together. They kind of.
Well, I don't really work with the concept of utopia, but so in my answer, I also picked the term from Steve's reformulation of my question. But on the other hand, I can also say that a lot of literature describing the Soviet project describes it in utopian terms. And it would be, if I would decide to do so, I could also use this term by engaging with this literature, because I think that the concept of utopianism is often used just to refer to any kind of alternative worlds and any alternative political imaginations.
But am I right that Soviet society would be described like bureaucratic urban society in this paper, not as a heroic society at all?
Well, I mean, about the Soviet society can be described from both points of view, depending on which period of time you take and what political positions you take. And I think this is precisely the complexity of this case, because some people would refer to the revolutionary experience and to the revolutionary utopia to argue against the bureaucratic modern states, and some would say that it was indeed the same bureaucratic modern states, but with even more violence. And and there are some in between, but you can argue, you can kind of use both arguments depending what you would like to argue.
But for me, when Vassily proposed to read this paper in connection with the new book, how I understood that is this paper is the first time unfolding the argument that the culture is a political project that Stephen correctly pointed out, and the political project is always exist together. They are kind of in constant, cultural wars and collaboration at the same time. They cannot exist without each other. So one is always producing this heroic, literature and games and this behavioral practices of being heroic and escaping the bureaucratic rules like society, and that in this paper called Surman, and in others, different, but actually it's a whole system as a only acting together. That's what I understand, and that's how David developed this argument later in the throughout his life. And the book that we're reading now is like very detailed description of the same thought, but now for 30,000 years. With
right.
all
Well,
this
I don't want to monopolize the space, but maybe the last thing that I would say here is that, of course, I mean, the whole Cold War relations, you can also describe in similar terms. You can say that the Soviet society produced the imagined West, which was kind of an ideal world within the late Soviet society, and that's why actually perestroika happened. And on the other side of the Iron Curtain, the left Americans, not only Americans, Europeans, looked very attentively to the socialist project in order to produce their own political alternatives. So kind of this duality, and or not duality, but rather that the meaningful other, which is often your neighbor, is actually constitutive to your own self-identity, is of course a very basic idea in anthropology, but it also, I mean, the case of the Cold War shows that of course you don't have like one heroic society on the one side and another bureaucratic modern society on the other side, but rather you have like both in each case. And it's just a question of which society you know better. And that's why you see different aspects of this complexity in each case, or you tend to create kind of ideal types and in a way essentialize both sides? To me, it's a
Interesting, but
real theoretical problem and also a problem of description, because it's really hard to describe it ethnographically when you know a lot about both sides.
But then in the beginning, also Stephen was talking about academia and how we in West, now we're all in West, we have this very developed apparatus, how we describe our urban bureaucratic commercial society through academia. Am I right?
Yes, absolutely. It makes these fake heroes because any intellectual, yes, intellectuals do intellectual work. They typically are heroically understood as these solitary figures working long hours, burning the midnight oil. But if we start from the premise that there is only joint mind, then at what point is someone is an intellectual the producers of their contributions to knowledge? And Jim Scott is a good example of someone who reached really heroic stature in the 1990s at Yale. And I can say that because I was in graduate school at the time at Yale and took classes with him. And much of his brilliance comes from his work ethic, but it also, and his sort of length of time in the profession. But he would be the first person to say, just as I think David did in that article about the monastic self, that he's the last person who is really the producer of his work. And he even mentions so much in many of the acknowledgments. He'll start by saying, this is Jim Scott, writing books is a solitary endeavor. I don't know why I ever chose this as a line of work. I think that is actually the start of domination in the arts of resistance. But he then goes on to talk about all these wonderful people who really, it's their ideas. He's just polishing them and sort of putting them in a different order. So I think humans will inevitably rely on categories. We will inevitably essentialize. Graeber's work, what I like about it is that it really starts from a social theory of action that assumes all actions to be intentional, whether conscious or unconscious. So to me, it's wonderful because I notice in the comments that schizmogenesis is used in psychology. And I find that helpful because it allows one to think of affect, emotional labor, but then also, a more Marxist kind of understanding of labor, so-called productive labor. Because, David's work was all about seeing a mode of analysis where you define a field, you start from first principles, and you extrapolate from there. And so it allows for the conscious and the unconscious because it accepts that humans are social creatures, and because we're social creatures, that we will behave in instinctual ways. And at bottom, I think, I've really tried to wrestle with this, is what is David Graeber's category of analysis? And even beyond cultural refusal, I think it's ultimately play and surprise. I think, and I think he's trying to, and to me, those are words that are more ontological than they are epistemological, because how can you prove surprise? How can you predict surprise? Right, it goes against the entire notion of the scientific method. And yet that, to me, in my reading, is what he's trying to get to, is an epistemology of of surprise and play and improvisation, which was why when Kenneth sent the email earlier where he, really chewed through these thoughts, I was in the midst of thinking through these things, and it was synchronicity or serendipity that it arrived just as I was thinking of this, because it really is I guess it's why the work is ultimately speculative, yet that there needs to be some scientific rigor there, knowing that the very notion of science is a political project. And what is it that's being considered as evidence, what gets transmitted, et cetera. It makes the very idea of what constitutes scholarship, I think, in this new era, it makes us rethink, where are those spaces of generation? And oftentimes those spaces of generation exist because the people who are doing the generating are saying, here's what we don't want to be like. And I think for us gathered here today, there is a certain element of what we're not wanting to be like. I don't know what that is. I'm not going to speak for the group, but I know what I do like being around, and do like thinking about. And maybe, this is a joint mind, even though only a few of us are doing the thinking, but all of my thinking is the result of all the reading, whatever reading I've done. Just looking at, Tanya has posted that it's her understanding that schizmogenesis in psychology has to do with interpersonal dynamics and conversation styles. That would be amazing, because it would then, to use myself as an example, there are times I can obviously be long-winded, but there are other times when I am in an encounter, an engagement with someone who I know to be through history long-winded, and I will decide not to be long-winded, because there's nothing worse than two long-winded people. One long-winded person is bad enough. I'm going to pause right there. And if there's an awkward silence, I will allow it.
And you wrote so much, it's very difficult for me to read in the chat. Maybe since we already coming to a conclusion, maybe we can, people who write in the chat can make a final statement or something. Can it? Maybe you want to tell something. Can it?
No, he's passing on this. And maybe someone who didn't hear that would like to react or to refuse what we've said so far.
Well, I don't want to react.
Yes. Okay. That's still okay.
But I'm just fascinated, and I appreciate the discussion. I was curious about the Gregory Bateson, where he got schizmogenesis from. And so I brought it up with my dad. My dad is a psychologist and my mom's an anthropologist. And my dad was like, oh yeah. And then he brought me this book. The Ecology of the Mind. So I'm actually in recovery. I'm in Alcoholics Anonymous, and apparently he did a whole chapter on the theory of alcoholism and the cybernetics of self. So I just got this, so I'm really curious about reading it and learning more about the system of refusal, because there's so much of recovery is about sort of reframing your relationship to alcohol or to some sort of substance. So there's just lots of different ways of looking at it in terms of internally yourself, and then like our own, you know, ecology, right, of the mind and our body, and then the ecology of our family, and then the ecology of our community, and then and on and on and on. So anyway, just thanks for listening.
Thank you, Tanya. I know that in this book, Bateson makes an important distinction between two types of schizmogenesis. I think this is symmetrical and complementary. This is something he also does in his thesis. But if you find because you're reading it, I haven't read it, but if you find like a chapter that might be interesting to read here, please don't hesitate to send the extract. That would be really interesting. I think we could read at some point, because we actually mentioned this notion of schizmogenesis in these reading groups very often, and that might be actually interesting to read it in the text. Matt was also asking about Gregory Bateson last time.
I love that.
Yeah, I would love to do that, because I'm trying to grapple. I haven't read his work other than just a few pages of a monograph that he did in 35. Because I'd especially be interested in seeing, I wasn't aware of the two types of schizmogenesis, symmetrical and complementary. I would love to see how those play out in his work, because, you know, structuralism, it relies on finding the inversions. And so I'm wondering where the inversions factor in, if, you know, I'm just curious how he draws those distinctions, because there are inversions going on, and that's where the schizmogenesis happens. But you know, how fluid is the model, I guess, is what I'm trying to get at. You know, where are the exchanges happening? The definitions, the actions, really. Let's take it one step down, the actions ultimately. So it's 4:06, so I want to be mindful of the time. We have had tendencies to go over. So this might be a good place to wrap up, unless someone who hasn't spoken would like, or really anyone would like to contribute. Otherwise, I think this might be a good stopping point. Do you know, Vassily, do we have the next Museum of Care meeting? I don't know off the top of my head, and I don't think I have it in front of me.
29 will be the reading group about education that the guest curators are organizing.
Oh.
And we return again to this monastic itself, that maybe will be, yeah, you, but some Andreas will talk about Nietzsche. And so, yeah, it's a bunch of people. So actually, Zinaida, if you want to talk about, or if we can ask you to talk about Soviet project on education, again, this Krushki, that will be very interesting, how to put it in the bigger picture. I'm actually so happy because I'm older, and when I was in my 20s, nobody was talking about Soviet Union, and now, and all this Soviet experience, and now we kind of started to reincorporate all this back to the discourse, and it's really interesting for me. So I would be very glad to talk about this as well on 29. So it's 29, 8 o'clock. It's I think it's next week.
Yeah, it's actually next week. It's funny because it's on a Sunday. Are you sure it's the 29th?
I don't know. We should look at the website. Okay, we will just send the.
Yeah. And also, so because the
that's a
the
Sunday.
initial idea was to read the anti-education. I mean, it might not be the place to talk about that, but it seems that it's going to be a bit broader than that, if I understand it well.
Yeah, they basically Andreas will be like the main speaker, and he will talk about anti-education. But then since they're holding this more like an assembly, and it's a first reading group, and they were not part of our reading group, so we decided that maybe it's good to have different people speaking and not concentrating on one big text, and more like do like a presentation. That's at least what happens to be their style, and they're going along with that. So
All right. Okay, that was nice to see some new faces. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. And yeah, thank you, Mark. Goodbye.
Everyone.